Hello, friends. Today's topic is patchouli. It's one of the most important ingredients in modern perfumery, and it's hard to imagine gourmand fragrances or even floral, ambery fragrances, woody fragrances, actually fragrances across the whole fragrance wheel use this note. And there is so much to talk about, so I will start with some of the most interesting aspects of patchouli oil and how it's used, and talk about classical fragrances. And in the second part of this series, I will talk about fragrances that are more recent. For those who are new to this channel, my name is Victoria, and I'm a professionally trained perfumer and a writer, and here I share my experience working in fragrance industry. And patchouli, of course, is one of the materials that a perfumery student learns during the first few weeks. It's that central. The ingredient comes from the leaves of a plant native to Indonesia and the Philippines, although today it's grown in China and in India and in Vietnam, quite a few countries. But the leaves, the fresh leaves of the plant, do not have a particularly distinctive scent. They need to be fermented, and only then the aromatic materials, the aromatic components evolve. And the main aromatic molecule of patchouli is patchoulol. And depending on the variety and the grade of the patchouli, it can occur at 25 to 45% of the oil. And it's quite a unique scent. It's quite rich. It smells earthy and musty, woody. And in fact, patchouli, even though it's derived from a leaf, it's classified as a woody note. So you will find it in the same family as cedarwood and sandalwood. But when patchouli is distilled, and it can be distilled by different methods, from steam distillation, which is the most classical, to solvent distillation, to fraction distillation, it all changes the material. So the steam distillation is the richest, it's the earthiest one, that has the musty smell that the lovers of patchouli cannot get enough of, and those who dislike patchouli just can't stand. And fraction distillation is the cleanest, softest, most transparent version of patchouli. That's the patchouli you'll encounter in many fragrances today, especially floral and floral woods. That kind of material is subtle, so the earthy component of patchouli can be quite strong. So if you do not want it to overshadow other notes, then you'll use a material which is cleaner. It's called cleaner in the industry. And the interesting part is that originally, when this material became popular in perfumery, it was in fact that earthy, heavy, rich note that was used in fragrances like starting from Coty Chypre in 1917, that made the famous Chypre Accord. And that accord really relies on the pairing of patchouli with its earthy, mossy, musty aspect, and oak moss, which is also quite rich, heavy, and has that musty, the borderline unpleasant, yet so addictive. And that classical Chypre is that. There are other notes that are important for Chypre, but patchouli is really key. And in fact, you can create a Chypre that smells realistically so without using oak moss, but without patchouli, Chypre is just not a Chypre. And many fragrances use quite a patchouli in quite a big proportion. If I were to name a fragrance which uses probably the biggest proportion of patchouli, it's Reminiscence Patchouli. And that fragrance is quite a clean. It's a clean version of patchouli because there is just not so much going there besides patchouli. It's really almost like a patchouli soli note. But it's a classical patchouli which is earthy and rich and dark, and it's accented with licorice, and patchouli naturally has a licorice facet. so that pairing works well. But because I promised to talk about classical patchouli fragrances in this series, so I should start with something which is a little bit unexpected as a use of patchouli. Chanel No. 5. You may not think of it as a patchouli fragrance, but it has a 0.1% of patchouli, and even though it's such a small proportion of the formula, the effect is quite striking, and it really works to offset the floral notes and the aldehydes. And patchouli works really well with anything from like very fresh, crisp notes like citrus or the champagne fizz of aldehydes, or heavier and richer notes. So, for instance, in Caron Yatagan, it's paired with leather and woods, very dark, rich, quite intense. And yet patchouli holds its own. It steps back so to allow the other facets of the fragrance come to the fore, but it doesn't lose its own character. And which is why this note is such a popular one in perfumery, because it can give a lot of character, and even in fragrances that are meant not to have too strong of a character or to be very likable and kind of easy to wear. So in large amounts, of course, patchouli will stake its claims, and it will be very prominent. But in small amounts, it nevertheless creates these shadows, which are quite beautiful. Some other interesting examples of patchouli, you can consider the classical Estée Lauder collection and also Clinique, such as Aromatics Elixir. I know that this fragrance has been reformulated a lot. It does not have the same richness as it used to, but it's still a really beautiful fragrance, and the patchouli note is still excellent. If you smell it, wait about an hour. After an hour in Aromatics Elixir, you really can start seeing the patchouli core. And if you smell it on paper, I do recommend spraying one blotter with Aromatics Elixir, waiting for 1 hour, and then spraying your fresh blotter and comparing the two. And this comparison, as you go back and forth, will allow you to see the patchouli and how it was used in the formula. And if you like those kind of fragrances, then Cabochard is another composition that also is very strong, intense, rich, very much a fragrance of its time. Then there is also Aramis. That's another fragrance that's a great example of patchouli, and many perfumery students study it because the way it conveys the character of the woods and the way it's put together. Quite intricate and interesting. And another fragrance is Miss Dior, and I'm talking about the version from 1947, and today it's sold as Miss Dior L'Original. And the patchouli in that composition really works beautifully with the white floral accord. Patchouli is not particularly big proportion of the formula, maybe perhaps 8 to 9%, but which in contrast to what is done today, when patchouli can be used up to 50% of the formula, then that's a small amount. Yet it's very prominent, and in pairing with tuberose, it's really beautiful accord in Miss Dior of tuberose and musk and green notes. Patchouli really creates this almost natural-like impression, earthy and yet somehow fresh and uplifting. There is another really beautiful fragrance called Jolie Madame by Balmain, and it's from the 50s, created by a legendary perfumer, Germaine Cellier. And that fragrance uses patchouli in a very unusual combination of violet. So on the one hand, you have this very soft Victorian violet, powdery and pretty, and then you have this intense, almost like aggressive accord of patchouli and woods. And that pairing is just fantastic. On the one hand, it's soft. On the other hand, it's really quite dark and almost transgressive. The combination is striking, and although it retains its elegance, there is this dark undercurrent that I find really unusual. And that fragrance, again, has been reformulated countless times, but there is so much character in the original that their formulations could not remove it. So these are my examples of classical patchouli fragrances, and next time I will talk about modern compositions with patchouli and explain how it's used in many different ways today. If you have any requests, please let me know in the comments. As always, thank you for watching and thank you for subscribing. Have a nice day.